A Bird's Eye View by Kelly Fiddes. I've always been intrigued by the Second World War, especially the psychology as to why so many people complied. Recently, I've wondered if the answers to my questions are simple. Was this a time in history where it was all just mass manipulation? Through the drip feeding of fear to German society, were they also victims? Was it all just a mass depopulation agenda from the start? I have so many questions about what happened, why it happened, and above all, why so many people conformed. After 2020 to 2022, I think back on how many people just blindly complied out of fear, how the majority just did as they were told, no questions asked. Thinking back to how a lot of humans have recently treated each other, there may now be more understanding of human behaviour from back then. I recall only 1 year ago people, politicians and celebrities demanding basic human rights to be taken away from the non-compliant ones. Some even wanted the non-compliant ones locked in camps. I've seen videos of people hitting other people on the streets to force them to comply with the rules, police brutality and crazy violent behaviour, whilst the government were throwing drunken gatherings and having karaoke parties. I know of families not speaking with each other because one didn't agree or comply with the government's demands. Just asking questions about the government's actions and agenda, or talking about the medical evidence or lack of evidence, one was suddenly branded as many things and treated as an undesirable member of society. Look how quickly humans turned on each other in this recent world crisis. How quickly humans turn because of something they were told by authorities. The sad thing is, would we have told these people in 2019 they would act like this 1 year from now? They would say we are insane and it would never happen. I witnessed an escalation where a mother who had learning disabilities and her son who was a carer, no older than 20 years old, wanting to enter a supermarket for shopping. Not only were they refused entry as it was a one-person only policy, but the argument escalated to the security guard spitting on the son. Imagine telling that security guard 1 year before this would be his behaviour. I think after 2020 to 2022, I can easily see who would have been who during the Second World War and who would have played which role. I think now we understand more how easily people can just turn on each other, or how easy it was back then just to comply. I think we now understand more how certain human behaviours can quickly escalate out of fear, control and manipulation. I'm not talking about the well-known individuals such as Himmler or Goebbels and their evil acts. What about the normal people, the everyday German soldiers? Being a sucker for history, biology and psychology, I thought to myself, what better way to investigate an individual's experience than someone in my own family? So I decided to investigate the standard German Second World War soldier, his life and his experiences. What a great opportunity I have to have a source who was actually there, rather than going off a movie or a documentary from someone else's point of view. I interviewed my German great-grandfather for a school project when I was 15, and I've interviewed family members who were born during or around the Second World War since. Luckily for me, he had pristine record keeping from documents, certificates to photos. Even luckier for me, no one in my family has much interest in any of this, so I have everything I need to be able to write his story. Ironically, freedom of speech is also a bit of an iffy subject while I'm writing this in 2023. So I would like to say that none of this is a personal, political or religious opinion. Any language used is not meant to offend anyone. This information and language used are from people's experiences. Everyone had a different one. My great-grandfather Rudy was the youngest of 11 siblings. He was a keen young technical engineer and decided to become a pilot for the Luftwaffe. He married Annie, a hairdresser. They met in the German military town of Minden. Annie was the youngest of 7 siblings. Her mother died of kidney failure when she was 14, so she was raised in her later years by her older sister Mia. Mia had a son who was tragically hit by a motorbike on the way to the shop and passed away at the age of 14. Mia could no longer have any more children and was suicidal at times. My aunts recall getting Mia out of the local lake after a suicide attempt. Therefore, Mia and Annie's relationship was a close and very important one throughout the war. Annie was the cook of the siblings. She was known in the community for her baking. She made marzipan chocolate-covered balls and the children would always knock on and ask if she had any. My aunts expressed Annie could have the smallest piece of meat and could make it last the entire week with the recipes she made. Rudy was happy to have a job and live a good life before the Second World War, as after the First World War, Germany was very poor. He said you could wallpaper your walls with Deutschmark and it wouldn't get you a loaf of bread. During Germany's Great Depression, someone wanting to decrease inflation, make Germany great again, was a dream come true for them. Rudy stated this is why Hitler had the support of most of the population. He created jobs and was all for the ordinary people. He expressed Hitler at that time was also someone most men could relate to. The fact he had fought in the First World War and won medals for bravery added to his popularity. He wasn't seen as a pen pusher or a status chaser like other politicians. In the few years before the Second World War, Hitler achieved rapid economic recovery from the Great Depression and the overturning of restrictions imposed on Germany after the First World War. Germany then became the largest industrial and engineering country in Europe. For Rudy, the first few years before the Second World War under Hitler's reign were the best he and many others ever lived economically. He stated for most of the German people during that time, Hitler was seen as a hero and a blessing that saved them and saved Germany. I asked Rudy about racism and if there was any talk of ethnic cleansing against the Jewish community or other communities before the Second World War. Rudy did not personally witness a race war against any ordinary man while Germany was recovering from World War I. He stated there were a few far-right bad eggs, as there always are and always will be, but for him there was not a divide in race or religion in his everyday life. It was the elite. They were seen as the bad eggs, the bankers, the previous government, the takers. Rudy stated he wasn't a political man, he was just like any other teenage soldier. He lived in his bubble and was happy to be employed, so he didn't pay much attention to politics. When the Second World War started, Rudy felt a greater purpose being employed for the protection of his country. He stated, "We thought we were the good guys." I asked Rudy about any racism witnessed during the war. He expressed how he lived in small garrison towns and on air bases, so he didn't see anything such as ghettos or stop and searches. However, in 1943 he had his first personal encounter with this issue. Marie and Herman were Annie and Rudy's neighbours. They became their friends and they all had children around the same age. They were a lovely German Jewish family and would see each other daily. One day Rudy was called into his superior's office and was told, "Your wife has a Jewish friend and has been reported to be going to her house daily." He was told this did not look good, a military wife having a Jewish friend. "She must stop seeing her, or your wife will be taken away as a sympathiser." His superior then stated, "She's lucky she has 4 children, or she would have been taken by now." My great-aunt told me how my great-grandmother ignored this demand. They would sneak out to see Maria in the dark in the evenings, so none of the neighbours would see them again and snitch. One evening, Annie and my great-aunt went round for their usual catch-up, and to their shock, the family and their belongings had gone. Annie had mixed feelings about this at that moment. Her hopeful mind thought they may have up and left, but another part of her thought maybe they had been taken away. When Germany invaded Poland, Rudy believed it was a response due to Poland killing 60,000 German refugees after Hitler ordered to let them go. Rudy's interest in politics was still not high, but he was happy at that time to be a pilot, to help German refugees and protect his country. Further into the war, he was tasked to bomb military bases in England. He would always hear through the media about lots of German civilian casualties by RAF planes. Therefore, Hitler also ordered bomb raids on Britain, and Rudy was happy to do so at the time. I could tell this was hard for him to explain to his British great-granddaughter, but I appreciated his honesty and his truth. I went on and asked Rudy about what was the worst thing he had seen. He and his co-pilot were flying over Cambridge in England on a bombing mission. The plane had been shot at and took a tumble. Rudy looked over at his co-pilot. To his horror, his co-pilot had the plane's control panel stuck in the front of his skull, while he was still alive and very much awake. They emergency landed in France and the co-pilot was rushed to hospital where he later died. On his next mission in 1940, during the Battle of Britain, Rudy's plane was shot down by Spitfire over Bristol, England. Rudy was shot in the arm. He didn't notice straight away. He and his then co-pilot managed to fly to France for another emergency landing, and Rudy was then flown to a hospital in Berlin. The tendons in his arm were so damaged, Rudy's arm had to be amputated from the shoulder. He stated it was removed with a saw. Till the day he died, he said he could still feel the pain and he could still feel his fingertips as if his arm was still there. Today this is known as phantom limb. After a long recovery in hospital, Rudy was sent home to the then garrison town of Frankfurt am Main, where his family were evacuated to. Rudy didn't leave the house for 7 months as he was embarrassed being so young and only having one arm. He hated being reliant on his wife and having to relearn to do the most simple tasks. He was eventually called back to duty where he was an administration clerk for the Luftwaffe, whilst the family were evacuated and relocated several times. During one of their evacuations, they were living in the small village of Halle, and my great-aunt attended primary school there. She recalls one day in class, as she heard the RAF planes approach in the sky, she jumped up, started running, crying and screaming. She looked around in confusion as all the other children started laughing and pointing at her. The teacher then had to explain to the other children that my aunt had lived in military bases and garrison towns, so when a plane approached, they would be bombed or they would shoot at them. My great-aunt had learned at that point that RAF were only flying over villages and small towns to then go on to bomb military bases and big cities. After their time in Halle, they went on to be evacuated to the nearby garrison town of Münster, where Rudy went on to continue his degree as an engineer whilst still working in administration. At this time Münster was being destroyed. Annie and the children spent a lot of their time on edge and inside bunkers. I asked my now 80-year-old great-aunts and grandmother about their memories and experience during the war. They stated they were children, it was awful, but normal, as they didn't know any different. You wouldn't wear pyjamas, you would go to sleep in your clothes, as the sirens could go off at any point. Getting changed could cost you your life. They recalled whilst living on air bases, they would copy the soldiers marching on the parade square, and Rudy would get into trouble and was told to control his children. My grandmother is the youngest and was born in 1943. Whilst Annie was giving birth to her in a dark hospital with no electricity, her 3 siblings were in the bunker with their Aunt Mia. They recall being worried about their mum and also being scared as the building next door was bombed to pieces that night. The most traumatic experience my great-aunt has is running through open fields trying to escape the low flyers, RAF planes. Whilst they were running to the end of an open field, they had to climb through a barbed wire fence. Whilst the others made it through and continued to run along an open field towards the woodland, my then 7-year-old great-aunt got her hair stuck in the barbed wire. Her mother ran back and pulled her hair out so hard that she remembers the pain till this day. Whilst they were running, the low flyers started shooting at them. Luckily they would miss and they all managed to escape into the thick woodland. My great-aunt went on to express it's strange the things you remember, the things that stick and never leave your memories. However, I should not be fooled by her traumatic experiences. She had many memories of humanity. She recalls during the sirens a lady running alongside them down the street towards the bunker. The lady had a baby in a stroller, however the wheels kept coming off. Many people would stop and help and keep putting them back on whilst running with them. Childless couples would knock on the door of families if they heard something was coming to ensure the families could get their children out of bed in time to evacuate. She went on to tell me about Rudy's sister, who was also called Maria. She worked in a Konsum. I understood this to be a type of food bank distribution factory. Maria would send parcels with food, textiles and shoes, as towards the end of the war, no one had anything. The whole country owned nothing and was not happy. Maria and her husband, who was a musician, wouldn't just secretly send food parcels to their families, they would also take parcels to local Jewish camps secretly at night. In fact, many of the factory ladies would do this. After the war, a lot of German soldiers were sent to prisoner of war camps across Germany, including Rudy. He was sent to an American prisoner of war camp in Ingolstadt, Bavaria. He said most Americans treated him well and most stated regularly that they didn't know why they were there in the European war. He was happy that it was an American camp, as he knew, had he been captured by the Soviets, he may not be alive. In July 1945, Rudy was one of the first to be released from the camp. He thinks this is because he was a one-armed administration clerk with 4 children and not really that important. Rudy had to somehow make his way home from Bavaria to Münster, which is 583 kilometres. So he and many others walked or rode a bicycle. They stopped at people's houses on the way. He said many people helped disabled soldiers. They would give them food and shelter for the night. Some lorries would also take soldiers a few miles if they had the space. Rudy always said, if I can ride a bicycle from Bayern to Münster in a pair of lederhosen, starving with one arm, then you can do anything. My great aunts and grandmother went on to describe to me their experiences after the Second World War. Everyone was in the same situation and had nothing. You would queue for hours for horrible bread, and by the time you got to the front, it was all gone. Rudy's sister continued to send packages when she could, and the contents would be divided equally, down to the crumb. They were told not to take any food outside, as other children would get upset that they didn't have anything. They stated without Maria's parcels, they were not sure how they would have survived the post-war times. Schools would be open, but children would only attend for half a day. They would swap AM and PM classes, as there were many children, but not enough safe buildings or teachers. The schools would receive food parcels from America, and they divided the food equally to the class. In their spare time, all the children would stand in a row at the train station to wait for the Ammies, Americans, and Tommies, British, to arrive. As the soldiers would throw their sandwiches and sweets to the children, it was the first time they all had white bread and peanuts. They played in rubble and abandoned buildings as they had no toys, but all of them stated they had the best time doing so. They would go on to become Trümmerkinder with the Trümmerfrauen. These are women and children that would hammer bricks into a straight usable form to sell. They would sell 1 brick for 1 pfennig, which would help rebuild the buildings. My great aunts and grandmother sold their bricks to the local bakery, who rebuilt their business using them. With the money, they would buy butter and brown sugar. When their parents were not at home, they would secretly melt the butter and sugar in a frying pan, let it go hard to make bonbons, then quickly ate them all until they felt sick. They all had fears going into adulthood after the war, such as the sound of planes or sirens. Even getting on a plane was terrifying. My grandmother had a fear of tattoos as a child, as she was taught back then that only criminals and Tommies, the British, had tattoos. So I can imagine her thoughts when my mother took home my father for the first time, a British soldier with a giant green snake tattooed on his forearm. They all stated even though they had nothing and it was a nightmare, they still had a great childhood as they didn't know any different. Had they known life differently beforehand, then they may feel differently about it now. When I asked their personal opinion on Hitler and the Second World War, they all stated they do not believe it's something that escalated. They believe it was Hitler's plan all along, that he purposely manipulated the German people with a good lifestyle in the hope of gaining their trust, then further manipulated them with fear and propaganda so he could fulfill his personal agenda. I asked about other family members. After all, my great-grandparents had many siblings. 2 were in the Kriegsmarine, the Navy of Germany. 1 was a swimming instructor who saved a lot of lives at sea. My great-aunt stated there was 1 brother, Peter, who was a bit dodgy. When I asked what she meant, she stated he was a police officer and expressed that he was the nicest person she had ever met. But he was part of the Gestapo, as were all police officers. I, in confusion, wanted much more information than this. However, the only thing she really remembers about him is that Rudy and Peter's father was against Hitler from the start. Their father would always have lots of opinions at family gatherings and regularly spoke against Hitler. She recalls that Peter would always say to his father, "Dad, you need to keep your opinions to yourself because if they take you away, I'll be unable to help you." I asked what happened to Peter and how I could find out more information. All she knew is that he died during the war whilst attempting to save a family from a burning building. Annie's beloved sister Mia continued to have a great relationship with Annie and all the children. She passed away in her 60s after having gallbladder surgery that went terribly wrong. After the war, Rudy went on to lay electrical lines during the rebuilding of Germany. He then became a civil servant for Münster Town Hall. When I asked Rudy about the horrors that happened in the camps, he said it wasn't common knowledge and it only came out after the war. If he or his comrades heard of anything unethical, it was mainly seen as an isolated incident or that someone had taken too much pilot salt, also known as pervitin, and lost their minds. Pervitin is now known as methamphetamine and was given to German soldiers to stay awake. He was in his airbase bubble, training camps, behind a desk or in the sky most of the war, so he didn't see that side of it. Mostly his comrades would talk about the torture techniques by the enemy that they were told of, such as the British drilling your teeth and exposing the nerves for information. Annie realised more and more that her dear friend Maria and her family had most likely been taken that night, but she still had hope that they just decided to leave and rebuild their lives happily elsewhere. Annie went on a mission after the war through Rudy's work at the town hall to search for her beloved friends. They were never registered anywhere else in Germany, nor were they seen or heard from ever again. For the rest of his life, Rudy managed to do everything with a prosthetic arm, including driving. In his spare time, he was a football coach and part of a disabled football team. Rudy and Annie passed away in their 90s, therefore children were never taught about the war in school, nor were they allowed to speak about it, as Germany was in great shame and everyone was just happy to go back to normal, although it was a new normal for them. Rudy and Annie have 7 grandchildren, 6 great-grandchildren, and 2 great-great-grandchildren. Some of us are dual nationalities and we are scattered across the world. Rudy expressed that looking back, the war was a big mistake for Germany and for everyone involved in it. It was an unnecessary suffering for all. He hopes that the lesson is learned and that humans will never repeat such a mistake. Rudy never stepped foot on a plane again.